Today at the National Press Club, the Chief Executive of the CSIRO, Dr. Larry Marshall, the head of Australia's science agency, will outline how technology and innovation are driving the nation's COVID-19 recovery efforts. Dr. Larry Marshall with today's National Press Club address.
Mark. Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address, broadcasting to you from Ngunnawal Ngambri country here in the nation's capital. I'm Misha Schubert, a Vice President and Board Director here at the club, and I also happen to be the CEO of Science and Technology Australia. This week, the Parliament will consider legislation to enshrine a national commitment to reduce Australia's national carbon emissions. And Australia continues to navigate a tricksy and complex global pandemic without a clear end in sight. We're also starting to turn our minds to the prospect of another pandemic beyond this one and the frequency of extreme weather events that are besetting many of our communities across this continent. And as we prepare also for a moment when antibiotics, which have been our frontline defence against infections for the past century, risk losing their potency amid a rise of new superbugs. These are big challenges and complex opportunities for the country ahead. And as Australia prepares to mark National Science Week in a fortnight, who better to outline that landscape for us today than the CEO of Australia's National Science Agency, the CSIRO, Dr. Larry Marshall. For those of you watching at home who want to be part of the conversation online, please join us. You can do so using our handle @PressClubAUST and our hashtag NPC. Would you please welcome to the stage of the National Press Club, Dr. Larry Marshall.
Thanks so much, Misha. Good afternoon. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on here today in Canberra, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders that are here in the room today, and I thank them for caring for the country that we're on and for sharing their knowledge, their wisdom, and their culture with all of us. Welcome to our business leaders who are building Australia's future industries. Welcome to our university leaders who are ensuring that our children have the skills and capabilities we need to build a better future. And welcome to our government leaders who are steering the ship. And hello to everyone at home. It's fitting that we have such a diverse group here today to talk about the future of our country because it impacts all of us, and every single one of us has a role to play in shaping that future. Now, you may know me as the Chief Executive of Australia's National Science Agency, the CSIRO. But what you may not know about me is I love to surf. But growing up on Sydney's northern beaches, there was something really important that I had to learn. I had to learn how to read the beach, how to understand the rips and dumpers and currents so I could be safe in the water. And I learned this lesson the hard way when I was 10, when I nearly drowned in a rip. But fortunately, a surfer pulled me from the rip and helped me back to shore, and that surfer inspired me to learn lifesaving, a tradition which I passed on to my two children, Patrick and Jessica. Australian beaches are beautiful, but they hide an uncomfortable truth. They can be deadly to those who can't read the surf or don't heed the warning signs. But a beach looks completely different to you if you know how to read it. It gives you choices. You might decide to actually use the rip to ride out past the waves and catch some even better waves. You might decide to avoid the rip altogether and swim in a different place. Or you might decide to stay in the safety of the sand. Megatrends are the same. Just like the rip, if you can't see them coming, they can be devastating. On the other hand, if you can see them, if you can understand them, if you can harness them, then they can power you into a better future. Today, all of Australia is standing on a beach. We are looking out into a sea of possibilities that could enhance and protect our environment, improve our health, and boost the performance of our industries. But in that sea are dangerous rips and currents. To create the future that we all want, we need to navigate all of them successfully. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Today, CSIRO releases a once-in-a-decade report on the seismic shifts that will change the way we all live over the next 20 years. You will hear about the 7 global megatrends that are going to impact each and every one of us and about what we need to do to prepare for them. Megatrends give a name to the uncomfortable truths and the massive opportunities that will literally shape our future. But they also give us the power to create a version of that future where we prosper if we act. We're living in a world full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And believe it or not, there's much more yet to come. Our future depends on our ability to understand the waves of disruption that are coming at us, to face the uncomfortable truths and respond together at scale. As a nation, we haven't always done this well. We spent 50 years understanding climate change, but we haven't invested in the large-scale transformative change that we now so desperately need to limit its impact. This failure to act is an uncomfortable and costly truth. But uncomfortable truths also show us where the greatest innovation can be found if we act. If we act. Analysing megatrends formed by thousands of data points collected over decades is how we read the rip. How we respond to that is up to each and every one of us. But unlike the beach scenario, there is no safety in staying on the sand because the water is rising up to meet us. And that's why the first megatrend is adapting to a changing climate. Now and into the future, the increasing frequency and cost of natural disasters is likely to overlap in multiple concurrent climate hazards, compounding the overall risk to people, communities, and industries. Climate change began as an environmental emergency. Then it became an economic emergency. And today it's a human health emergency. In Australia, heat-related deaths are expected to grow by 60% by 2050, with Perth forecast to be the worst hit. In 2020, there were 673 heat-related deaths in Perth. That's forecast to be 1,400 lives lost every year by 2050 in one Australian city. But the term emergency doesn't really cut it. It suggests that if we act quickly, it'll all be fixed and it'll all be over. The uncomfortable truth is the world has missed its opportunity to limit dangerous climate change within this century. We will need to wait until the beginning of next century to see the benefit of emission reduction that we do today. So we must adapt to a changing climate while we wait for the world to reduce its emissions. We need to adapt our healthcare system, our critical infrastructure, our settlement patterns, and our disaster preparedness. After the Black Summer fires of 2019, CSIRO led the review of climate and disaster resilience in partnership with the Australasian Fire Authorities Council, the Bureau of Meteorology, and a raft of other co-contributors. We're already applying the recommendations of that report, including implementing a collaborative and truly national approach. harnessing advanced technologies like artificial intelligence that literally outthink fire so we can get ahead of it, and collaborating with Indigenous leaders to deeply understand traditional knowledge and burning practices. And this collaborative approach is also how we're delivering our national program of missions to address Australia's greatest challenges, especially the 7 megatrends, including building resilience to drought, preparing Australia's enterprises for climate shocks, and protecting our precious water resources. But there is much more that we must do. A key element of that response is contained in our second megatrend, leaner, cleaner and greener. Australia has ridden the wave of fossil fuels for 30 years, but it's time to catch a new wave, renewables. They'll account for 80% of the growth in global electricity demand by 2030. Australia has the highest wind and solar capacity per capita of any developed nation. We have a wealth of critical minerals needed for low emissions technologies, and we have an incredibly skilled workforce. We can become a superpower in clean energy. But the uncomfortable truth is, there's something standing in our way. It's our innovation problem. We haven't invested in the innovation needed to capture this opportunity and transform our economy beyond fossil fuels. But that is starting to change. Through the CSIRO, Australia invented a liquid renewable fuel that could tackle our most difficult emissions. And through our hydrogen industry mission, we're backing it to create a $50 billion per year hydrogen industry in both domestic terms and global exports. We're also working with our partners on missions to accelerate towards net zero, to end plastic waste, to turn our raw minerals into high-value products to feed the world's hunger for renewable energy, and to evolve our agricultural sector to produce more food, more sustainably, and from more sources. But there is much more that we must do. A changing world affects our health, which is why the third megatrend is the escalating health imperative. Now, there's a strong correlation between infectious disease and how we as humans choose to interact with our world. And this means we are moving into a world of greater pandemic risk, not less. Growing resistance to antibiotics is another significant threat to human health, already responsible for 1.27 million deaths per year worldwide. And more than 11 million Australians suffer from chronic disease. That's nearly half our population, and it's going up. The uncomfortable truth is we need a far greater focus on preventative and precision health and new approaches to infectious disease and superbugs that consider the interconnection of health of people, health of animals, and health of the environment. Now, CSIRO faced this uncomfortable truth in 2016 as we prepared for what we called Disease X, which turned out later to be COVID-19 in 2019. Now we're collaborating across the system on missions to increase Australia's resistance to infectious disease and to combat antimicrobial resistance. Australian scientists at the University of Queensland, the Doherty Institute, James Cook University, and many, many others across the entire sector are leading work in key parts of this area, supported by our world-class facility, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness in Geelong. A national lab so unique, it is the only one of its kind in either the southern or the eastern hemispheres. But there is much more we must do. The fourth and fifth megatrends are linked, but importantly quite different. They are diving into digital and increasingly autonomous artificial intelligence. Now, the next wave of digital innovation is expected to create $10 to $15 trillion global opportunity. But Australia is lagging behind other advanced economies in capturing the value that's being created here. Now, it's true, digital technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence, will literally consume many of the jobs that we know today. But on the other hand, just to keep pace with the rate of change in the world, Australia will need 6.5 million more digital workers just by 2025. The uncomfortable truth, we've focused on the threat to existing jobs instead of seizing future opportunities, particularly for our regions where teleworking, online access, and revolutionary future business models and industries can literally be transformative. Artificial intelligence is already helping us to solve challenges like accelerating vaccine development, predicting drought, and stabilising our energy grid. And in time, it will change every aspect of science and industry. Whether we come out on the winning side of this or the losing side of this disruption is entirely decided by what each one of us decides to do next. But I am very optimistic about the future. CSIRO's Innovation Fund, Australia's first venture capital fund founded within government, is managing more than $500 million of mostly private money to invest in startups from science all across Australia's innovation sector. Overall, CSIRO has helped to create more than 250 new companies and thousands of jobs from Australian science, from CSIRO and the entire university sector. My hope is that that trend will continue and it'll see our children using Australian innovation to create a better world from new jobs grown right here in Australia. But again, there is much more that we must do. The world our children live in will look very, very different to today's, not just environmentally, but politically as well. And that's why our sixth megatrend is geopolitical shifts. Now, we're all already feeling the effects of disrupted patterns of global trade, growing geopolitical tensions and even war, following decades of growth fueled by globalisation. But the uncomfortable truth is, it took a global pandemic for us to realise that we'd lost sovereign capability as we grew reliant on exporting raw materials and buying back and importing the skills and technologies that we need. Australia's world-class science attracts international students to our great universities. It strengthens our international partnerships, and it is truly the common language that transcends all political boundaries and brings us together to solve shared challenges from climate change to pandemics. This is also the key basis behind CSIRO's national missions. And they're quickly becoming international missions as we collaborate around the world on challenges that know no borders. But there is much more that we must do. The seventh and final megatrend, unlocking the human dimension, for me is perhaps the most important of all because it holds the key to how we solve the other six. Trust in institutions had been falling for over a decade. But in Australia, COVID-19 saw trust spike in scientists. The uncomfortable truth is, it took a global pandemic to get the nation to turn to science for solutions. Trust in science led Australia's response to COVID-19. And we can build on that trust now to put science at the centre of a united response to the challenges ahead. As I've said repeatedly, there is much more that we must do, but science can show us the way. Now, these 7 waves of disruption are bearing down on our country. The question is whether we're brave enough to catch them. Now, catching a wave is all about seeing it coming and getting yourself into the right position before it breaks on top of you. Innovation is the same. But when was the last time that Australia caught a really big wave of change? 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth hasn't motivated us to innovate and find the new waves of prosperity where we can actually lead. We've fallen behind while others have raced ahead. While investment in research and development around the world has gone up, in Australia, investment has gone down for decades. But much worse than that is our innovation problem. We have amazing research in this country capable of extraordinary invention, but we remain well behind on innovation, turning those brilliant ideas into something real that can actually change the world. Both Wi-Fi and low-cost solar design were invented right here in our country. Wi-Fi by CSIRO and the solar cell design by the University of New South Wales. We're at the dawn of two new global industries in the palm of our hands, but as a country, we lacked the market vision and the courage to back ourselves. And instead, that research was commercialised by the United States and China, respectively, who now dominate those markets globally. They saw the wave coming and they swam out to meet it. We have a history in this country of not backing ourselves. We have a mortal fear of being wrong and getting dumped. But the alternative is like sitting on the sand while we wait for the water level to rise up and cover us, and eventually we get dumped anyway. We need to change course. We need to be brave enough to do some really uncomfortable things. But now we have the momentum to do it. COVID-19 showed us what we can achieve when we combine the power of science with an urgent need and a network system of willing collaborators. We need to do this again, and again, and again, until it becomes as natural to us as is swimming. The only way we're going to be able to do this is by working together in a mission-like way to transform at a pace and scale we have never come close to achieving before. But we can do it. We can do it. Over the last 10 years, Australia has reduced the amount of plastic waste on our beaches by nearly a third. The world's first liquid hydrogen carrier sailed from Melbourne in January. And this year, sales of Future Feed began, a feed additive invented by Australian science that tackles 15% of the entire world's emissions, those that come from cattle. But this time was different. This time Australian organisations like Woolworths, Meat and Livestock Australia, James Cook University joined together with CSIRO to take this innovation to the world. This is Team Australia addressing our innovation problem, working together across the ecosystem in a mission-directed way, creating a tide that lifts all boats up and over those waves of disruption. Imagine if every Australian researcher, every Australian business, and every Australian government department with the same challenge was part of the same team, working together on a mission for Australia. We could obliterate our innovation problem. And when we did that, we could solve any challenge the world cared to throw at us. Our megatrends have shown us the future. And COVID-19 has shown us what we can achieve when we work together. Now we need to be smart enough, brave enough, and collaborative enough to invent the kind of future that we all want. Science is the key to this, but it can only create the future if we let it. If we dream big and invest big, we can solve the impossible. Let's dream big right now. Imagine you're back on that beach where we started, but it's 20 years into the future. Our megatrends have played out, but humanity has responded with innovative solutions not just to survive, but to thrive. So what does our beach look like? To start, it's probably in a different location, further inland, back behind where the sand dunes were 20 years ago, and behind the foundations of the houses that used to be there on the beach. The marine life has also changed because of rising temperatures, ocean heat waves and acidification. Many species no longer exist in this ecosystem. But we are not without hope. Looking out to sea, there's an offshore wind farm sending power to a hydrogen desalination plant just around the headland. The plant takes salt water from the ocean and uses it to convert wind and solar into hydrogen and stores some of that hydrogen to stabilise our electricity grid. The rest is converted into liquid renewable fuel and exported around the world. Australia is as energy rich as the oil nations once were, but it's all renewable. The fresh water that's produced from the hydrogen is used for agriculture, like growing plant-based protein, now a multi-billion-dollar industry for Australia that's helping us fill the global food gap. Our electricity sector is almost net zero, running on a combination of solar, wind and storage. But the solar is printed in Australia, just like paper. And the wind turbines use Australian rare earth magnets, and the batteries are made here. And hydrogen stands ready to fill the gap whenever the sun doesn't shine for a few days or the wind doesn't blow. But today, on this beautiful Australian beach, it's a windy day. And as you take a deep breath of the air, you realise it's actually better air quality than it was when you were a child, thanks in part to the electric vehicles that fill the parking lot behind you. A lot of plastic waste used to wash up on this beach, but that's all changed because today we see the value in plastic, so we have no waste. Everything is designed with an end point or a completely new use in mind. Further around the headland, there's a port shipping out refined rare earths and superconductors into high-value global supply chains to feed the world's never-ending hunger for energy and renewable energy solutions. There's also heavy industry around that port, and it's running on a combination of renewable electricity and hydrogen fuel. And it's producing Australia's pioneering green steel that is sought after around the world. Suddenly, the heads-up display on your glasses shows you're on amber alert. It's monitoring your health status and it's realised your blood pressure is a little bit too high. An appointment is automatically made with your doctor and you approve it. Then you realise it's gotten a bit hotter now and your display tells you you're getting close to your maximum heat exposure. You need to cool down. So you decide to go for a swim. After reading the surf, which you do really well, you confidently dive into the waves. Confidently. Australia has all of the inventions today to do everything that I just described in that 20-year future vision. We can create this future if we choose to do it. It all depends on our ability to see those waves of disruption coming, to face those uncomfortable truths, and to band together to respond together. Now, we are probably going to get dumped a few times along the way, but there is no safety in staying on the sand. The race to an uncertain future is not one that you want to lose. We need to innovate and adapt, and we need to do it on a tremendous scale. It's an enormous task. But then again, so is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. But by working together, by backing ourselves and by investing in Australian innovation and by building on the trust in science that the pandemic response has grown, we can make the seemingly impossible become possible. Science gives us this ability to see the waves of change coming instead of drowning in the rip. But we have to act and we have to do it together. At this moment, we're all standing on the beach, but we can't stay there. It's time to wade out into the ocean. It's time to swim out and face our challenges. It's time to ride the wave of change that carries every single Australian into a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. Excellently to time, so good. So much in that speech to unpack, and we might just start with a few questions and then move to the floor and our members of the working press here today. You're a science guy, but you're also an innovation and finance guy through your career, and someone who has commercialised technologies in many different guises. So perhaps if we can pick up the part of your speech where you were talking about that opportunity that you see for Australia around the renewables sort of sector, and particularly I'm interested in your thoughts on how Australia gets itself to a position where electric vehicle manufacturing onshore is a realistic prospect at scale to speed the uptake of consumer use. We know from research that there is huge appetite in Australia for consumers to purchase electric vehicles. Price points are where they are. How do you see that mapping out, or how should that map out for our country?
Yeah, you know, you're reminding me, in a decade ago, I founded a thing called the Renewable Energy Venture Capital Fund. And our hope was to invest in Australian renewable technology, a lot of it from CSIRO, but a lot of it from the Australian universities, and actually get it into global markets. But the world wasn't quite ready then for that approach. We're a little bit ahead of the wave, so it didn't come. It's already here, and I'm wishing that we'd started that fund about 5 years later than we did, but that's okay. What we've done in CSIRO and what we've done with the university sector, I think, has prepared Australia really well to capture that opportunity. But we're still not seeing the investment appetite and the really breakthrough cutting edge stuff that we need to grab hold of these opportunities before everyone else sees them. Having said that, amazing mineral wealth, amazing solar and wind resources. So I think there's a few areas where we could create things that the world can't because of our natural unfair advantages. We could build some really big industries there. We're starting to see Australian industry lean in a bit. We're starting to see Australian research lean in a bit. If we can join them in the middle, and I see CSIRO very much as a bit of a natural bridge to bring them together and help get those amazing inventions into real world products, then I think we can achieve this vision that I described. Mm-hmm.
And you obviously see batteries as part of that mix as well, of the things we could potentially have a much stronger global leadership role around?
Yeah, so there's a question. We mine lithium, we ship it overseas, someone else refines it, processes it, and we buy it back as a battery. Could we take lithium a bit more upscale from a raw material? Might we make a battery electrode? I promised the team I wouldn't pull the electrode out of my pocket, so I won't. But there are a number of products that we could make here where global supply chains would actually value that, and they'd pay us much more than they do for the raw lithium, if we can solve some pretty important science challenges to do that. We have, for example, you may not be familiar, but gold mining has been shut down in a number of countries because it uses cyanide and arsenic, which are really bad for the environment. To prove this thesis that we could reinvent an existing industrial process and make it environmentally friendly, we invented a process that eliminated the cyanide and gold. And what we learnt there is helping us rethink how lithium is processed. I think it's a huge opportunity for Australia.
Mm-hmm. The other issue that's been really topical and in the news cycle across the last fortnight has been the release of the latest State of the Environment report, which paints a pretty bleak and compelling picture for the country about what the nature science tells us around the state of our natural environment. We do have a question kind of sent in by one of our viewers by the ACF asking about that topic and the picture painted there about biodiversity and species loss. The question is essentially, you know, we've got these big wins happening at the global level. The World Economic Forum's declared the three biggest threats to the globe and humanity being climate action failure, extreme weather events, and the biodiversity loss that we're seeing at scale around the world. New global goals about to be set in Montreal in December. And next year we're going to see the introduction of some new financial disclosure regulations that are going to apply to companies around accounting for their impact on nature. Do you think the decline, that the biodiversity issue has had too little attention in Australia, and how alarmed are you by the scale of the challenge here?
And you said the person was from ACS?
Australian Conservation Foundation.
Oh, sorry, because there's a thing called the Australian Climate Service, which we're part of, that's us and BOM and ABS, that is designed pretty much to really look at this area and gather much more data, not just for environment, but for climate change. There's also the National Environmental Science Program, which we're part of, all 5 of them, in terms of dealing with some of these issues. But our national missions are really aimed very specifically at some of those challenges. And Australia has extraordinary biodiversity, and it's a gift, but it also means that if it's impacted, it's a huge loss. Our missions, some of them are really very much designed to protect our precious water resources, like our drought mission and our Aqua Watch mission, because all that biodiversity is really harmed by, for example, a drought. It's also harmed by floods and by fires. It's also harmed by how we interact with the land. I will pull out one prop in a minute and show you one of the amazing breakthroughs the team in the lab's done for dealing with this. But the biggest place where you can all help, we run a thing called the Atlas of Living Australia. It's how we characterise those millions of species. And there's a lot of citizen science in that. So all of you can download the app to your phone. When you see a species you don't recognise, you can take a picture of it, you can upload it, tracks the location, helps us identify exactly what we've got. And Australia has literally millions upon millions upon millions of species. We discover many more every year. So it's a huge gift, but it's why we have to do extraordinary measures to protect it, but you can all help.
So the elephant in the room on that report, though, was around the scale and the rate of land clearing that's happening in our country at the moment, because that's the biggest single determinant of the kind of rate of species loss, is essentially what that report seemed to be saying. As the head of our National Science Agency, how concerned are you, and how much of an alarm bell do you think, do you want to sound on that?
So Csiro was created to kind of, as I said, fill that gap between the broader research community and industry. So wherever we can, we step in to help industry be much more environmentally sustainable than perhaps they have been in the past. And let's face it, you and I grew up in an era where it was sort of axiomatic that industry and environment were competitors. A lot of the science that Csiro has been focused on, particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, has been around breaking that paradigm. And we found industry is incredibly willing to change their practices if we can show them another way. And Australian science, through things like Future Feed, completely broke that nexus in, because getting rid of emissions from cattle seemed impossible until your science could solve that and then make it possible. It's not economically any better, but industry's doing it because it's the right thing to do. The other prop that I will pull out of my bag, sedimentary runoff is a major problem in Australia, particularly for the Great Barrier Reef. And you may not know this, but how we use the land and the runoff that happens from land use into the ocean affects many things, from biodiversity to loss of coral. And this is a unique material invented by CSIRO and our university collaborators. It doesn't look like much, but you literally spray it on the soil. It can hold the fertiliser in it so that the fertiliser doesn't wash away and doesn't end up in the ocean. It also holds the soil together, and all the little bugs and critters that live in the soil get protected underneath it. It doesn't wash away, and then over time it slowly gets biodegraded and absorbed into the soil to provide more nutrients. And if you recall, one of the observations in that report was the soil quality is degrading. This can actually help improve it. It can also significantly reduce the amount of water that we need to irrigate our crops. So it hits a number of those key areas. Again, thought to be impossible until science actually solved the seemingly impossible. We need to do more of this. We have big problems, but science can give us the solutions if we back ourselves. We don't have to get everything from overseas. We can invent it here and innovate it here.
Great. We're going to move to a period of questions from some of our working journalists, the first of whom is Jess Malcolm.
Hi, Jess Malcolm from the Australian newspaper.
Hi, Jess.
A bit of a long question, so bear with me. Last year, the CSIRO terminated an oceans research partnership with a Chinese institution with close military links. There's also strong evidence that multiple CSIRO scientists have accepted Chinese 1,000 Talents Plan scholarships, although that is denied. How many of CSIRO's researchers have faced serious investigations over their links with Chinese institutions? Have you ever uncovered any issues of foreign interference or theft? And do you do this work in-house or seek outside help?
So Jess, you're right, it's a long question. I might have to take it into pieces. So firstly, we didn't terminate anything. We signed a 5-year agreement, and the 5 years finished, and we didn't sign another one, but we never really had intended to sign another one. So we did what we planned to do, and the 5 years was up. In terms of the 1,000 Talents program, I don't believe that any Csiro person has been part of that program, but we have some amazing Csiro scientists who are of Chinese ethnic descent, and they've made incredible contributions to some of the innovations that we've done. For example, our ability to try and predict drought using our climate modelling and our measurements. And by the way, we get our measurements. We actually sail robotic sailboats out to gather data about ocean temperature. Things that we used to send people out in a boat and put them in harm's way, because the southern oceans can be pretty dangerous, we now do autonomously, so that those scientists, rather than being at risk, they can actually focus on solving those problems. The challenge that both China and Australia face, we both have droughts and we both have floods. For them, the flood is probably worse, and for us, the drought is probably worse. But it's the same science. If we can predict drought for us, we can help them predict flood. That means the world has more stability, better food supply. So there's a deep partnership between Australia and China in industry and in science. It was also instrumental to us understanding the pandemic faster than perhaps other countries did.
I'm just wondering specifically, have you ever uncovered any issues of foreign interference or theft?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
None. Great, thank you.
Our next question is from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Canberra IQ. I think there's an internal conflict in what you presented today. You canvassed three pretty important disruptive megatrends, not least climate change, and you predicted that the people who own houses in Manly and Mona Vale are going to be buggered pretty soon. God knows what it would mean for the Burdekin or the Mekong, the Shanghais, all the rivers where people live. You also talk about health issues, more pandemics, both human health and animal health. And you talk about the geopolitical stuff, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, for one of a better three. But also you say, as the size of the global population continues to grow, and as more people transition from lower to higher income brackets, how can more people be using more material resources and living a better, happier life, while all this other stuff is attacking that?
Can I just play your question back, because I want to make sure I understand it? So,
Sure.
Growing population, growing worlds, megatrends, and how do we end up with a better life? Is that the question?
The assumption that a higher proportion of a higher population are going to be living a better material life in the face of all these major problems.
Right. So problems are, and they're massive problems. Let's not underrate those 7 waves of disruption. I love riding waves. I used to catch one at a time. I've never tried to catch all 7 at once. It's very hard. But they also create extraordinary opportunity. So take the progression to net zero. We sort of fear it because historically our industries have been based on digging up raw materials and exporting them overseas. We're going to have to add a bit of value to those raw materials. We're going to have to create some new things like hydrogen, things that we haven't done before, but that's a $50 billion opportunity for Australia.
All you're talking about now is Australia. All you talk about now is Australia.
I'm getting to the world, but I've got to start.
Well, it's the world that's the issue.
I've got to start somewhere. So that innovation creates new value. This is the difference between science innovation, I think, and other types of innovation. Often we think innovation is a zero-sum gain. I'm going to take money from you by creating a new service. For example, Uber competing with the established taxi business. But when science creates something, when science solves something impossible, like producing a liquid renewable fuel, it grows the market. It makes the market bigger, which is why I say it literally lifts all boats up and over that rising tide. As far as the quality of life, if we don't address climate change, if we don't address sea level rise, then quality of life for all of us will go down. And in our Australian National Outlook we published in 2019, we showed that scenario as well. Again, particularly for Australia, but it would be true for most of the world. If we don't innovate and adapt, we won't be able to create the value that we need to rise the whole world up into a better future than we have now.
Okay, mate.
We're delighted that he's now a Canberra resident. Our next question from James Riley.
Hey Larry.
Hey James.
James Riley from innovationoz.com. Thanks for the presentation and a very interesting report. If nothing else, it shows there's a lot going on right now that we need to be putting our attention to. Just on diving into digital megatrend, that's sort of the area that I look at, so AI and 5G and all that stuff. You rightly say that there are huge opportunities globally, but for Australia also, and also point out that historically Australia has left a lot of value on the table, productivity-wise and developing local industry and that kind of thing. So what's the prescription? This is kind of always as it's been. So what's some of the low-hanging fruit as far as structural changes that might alleviate some of those issues? And secondly, on AI regulation, AI, obviously, huge opportunity. How do we kind of regulate or put up safety rails around AI without, hobbling, our ability to innovate?
That's a great question, James. So AI is pretty scary because it does have the capacity to literally consume many of the jobs that we know today. But that's going to happen anyway because the world is going to progress on that. I guess three things for me about AI. We've got amazing AI research capability in this country, but like many things, it's fragmented. It doesn't really align well and it doesn't necessarily collaborate well. So for that reason, CSIRO worked with the government to try and create a national AI network. They call it a centre, but it's really a network because the AI is everywhere in many research institutions. John, who's just behind you, has been pulling that together. And we're so lucky we're able to convince the head of AI at Microsoft, Stella Solar, to come back to Australia and actually lead that effort. And she's extraordinary, digital scientist. So I think that will bring us together, will give us some alignment about the big challenges. And then the other thing about AI is Australia many times tries to boil the ocean, but we can't afford to do that anymore. We've got to pick a few areas where we can really be world class. You've already seen us, James, tackle this question of ethics of AI, making sure that decisions can be interrogated and validated and really trusted. But we've got a couple of other sort of interesting areas we're working on where that seventh megatrend, unlocking the human dimension, all of us, despite the threat to our jobs, all of us have this unique human ability to see the innovation possibilities. And when we actually embrace these disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence, there's literally a collaboration that happens between the human brain and the AI brain that creates something much better, more valuable than either one could do alone. And I think once we get over our sort of fear of AI and start to embrace it, we'll start to realise how important we are, the humans, to help make the AI really make a difference in certain key industries in Australia, like agriculture, like healthcare, and particularly predicting disasters. AI is incredible at helping you figure out what a fire is going to do, which helps the fire service go fight it before it does it. It's magic, but only in the hands of someone who's got a deep market expertise or a deep understanding. Put them together, you get amazing outcome.
And on the first part of James's question around structural reforms that would be helpful towards that goal of banking more wins on innovation?
I'm not sure what I can say about structure, James.
Well, I guess my point is that Australia's always struggled to extract value from the IT sector to build local capability and deliver value to export markets.
So what we found, in Csiro, what we found, we created Data 61 to really explore digital opportunities, and what we discovered is there's an amazing wealth of verticals, markets that are purely digital that you can go after, and the fintech market's a great example, which Australian industry is doing really well at. But we also discovered there's also a horizontal, because AI, or digital, is in everything. And John, I think, has done a fantastic job at balancing both of those. So we kind of get the best vertical support and the best horizontal. I don't think every industry has embraced digital the way it should. And I don't know that that's a structural problem, but maybe an opportunity for us and others to get out there a bit more and give them exposure to how it really can transform their business.
Our next question is from Nick Stewart.
G'day. One part of me really wants to ask if, when you were young and you didn't peroxide your hair so you wouldn't get beaten up as a nerd on the northern beaches. The second part of me really wants to ask why CSIRO doesn't do something sensible, like spend a lot of time and effort researching male pattern baldness, which is much more of an issue for me now, personally. But the real question is why, you say, you make the point about we all know Wi-Fi was invented in Australia, and yet we never capitalised on that. We've got organisations now that have come out of Csiro, like Data 61 and so on, which are working towards actually commercialising particular inventions. Wouldn't it be ideal if, from a broader point of view, government actually took the risk of picking winners? Shouldn't we say that now, look, we've got the fantastic scientific organisation like Csiro, we've got terrific ideas coming up. Don't we need to actually say, as a country, look, it's worth really investing in this, saying that hydrogen will work, making that a signature issue, and just going after it without any of the qualifications that currently our political environment forces us to put on these sort of issues?
So, no, I didn't peroxide my hair. So I think government, not picking winners per se, but picking sectors where Australia can be strong. I think government, both this government and the previous one, are starting to do that. When I started at Csiro, the notion of a national science agency moving kind of into the valley of death that celebrates research and industry, commercialisation, it was kind of seen as, that's a bit odd. Now, even the United States, one of the world's leading innovation economies, is starting to come to that way of thinking that it is a role for national science agencies and governments to be a little bit more focused on certain markets. But you're seeing government do that. Governments are naturally quite reluctant and cautious about that because they get lobbied by every market and every industry player and every researcher to invest in their sector. So they've got to really be careful about making those choices. But I think as a country, we're going on a good track to actually get a little bit more focus. And can I say one other thing? There's often a call to focus research in the universities, and that's a mistake, I think, because you need a really broad funnel. You need to research everything, and universities are incredible at discovering things that you would never have thought to look for. So you need that broad funnel because so little of it gets kind of through to be commercialised. So I've begged many people on the government side not to mess with the breadth of university research. And trust me, in the US, they went through this same lesson, that if you try to focus it down, you get less rather than more. And Brian Schmidt can tell you that from personal experience. But I think Australia is on a great track. We're starting to realise we can't do everything, but there's a handful of things we can do potentially better than anyone else in the world. And renewable energy, I think, is one of them.
We're doing it well. Do we need to actually establish an organisation under government to say, right, this is a winner, we're picking it, we reckon you should back it?
I think industry and I think industry does a pretty good job of the financial part of that. The reason we created the venture fund inside government was we wanted to test that idea. Never been done before, and government's very, very cautious about being too directive on that. But our hope and what we've seen with all the investments that we've done, for example, in Csiro and in Main Sequence Ventures, our venture fund, industry has always come to the party. So that story about Future Feed or V2 Foods, we put in the first few million to kind of make it real, but it was industry. Companies like Woolworths or FMG have come in afterwards to put 50 or 100 million in to turn it into a real Australian business, something at scale that can employ Australians. I think that's what government wants to see, is industry really stepping up to the plate, and they're okay to do the original risk, a little bit of risk money to get it going. And that's kind of the model we've been using, and it seems to be working. And by the way, other countries like Canada, Singapore, and even the National Science Foundation in the US are starting to look at that model and go, gee, Australia's doing something interesting here, something different. It's not often we get them looking at us, and while they're looking at us, let's take advantage of that.
Male pattern baldness.
I think that's
great.
about 4 questions now. Our next question is from David Denham.
David Denham, Preview Magazine. That was a very inspiring talk. And I think I'd just like to make one comment. The timing today is impeccable because you may not know it, but tomorrow is Earth Overshoot Day. This is when humanity's resource consumption per year exceeds Earth's capacity to regenerate. But what I'd like to ask is the science is really good, but could you outline more what you think about what we should do in social interactions? Because there's so much wealth disparity locally, nationally, and diplomatically. And it seems to me that the science is there to make a sustainable planet, but it's the people interaction that could be much improved.
So I mentioned that Australia has reduced the amount of plastic washing up on our beaches by almost a third. A huge reason that's the case is not so much the physical science, although a lot of us have reinvented polymers and made them recyclable or give them a second life as another product. But the real value, the real big change is in the social science, in the way that the Australian public have really rallied behind this mission. And let's face it, a piece of plastic always started out in someone's hands before it ended up in the ocean or the environment. Australians have really changed their behaviour there. You know, my wife and our 2 children, we clean up the local beaches many weekends, along with many other residents where we live. And most people who live near a beach in Australia do the same thing. That wasn't the case when I was a kid. When I see things like that, you know, Team Australia fixing our own problems, it makes me realise how powerful it is if we can couple great science with great social science, we can get huge change. And finally, getting to net zero, there's a number of not necessarily easy, but really important social changes we can make to reduce our energy consumption to make getting to net zero much easier. And I don't know if I had the privilege of meeting former Prime Minister, the late Abe, in Japan several times. And he was a visionary that had a vision of using science and technology to absolutely minimise the energy that we use and still give us the quality of life, the quality of environment that we really need, but using science and technology to manage it for us, knowing we can't always manage it for ourselves. I think in Australia, we're actually conscious enough of the issue that we are starting to manage it ourselves in a far more responsible way. I think that's something that we can bring science and social science together.
Thank you.
And our next question is from the fabulous Tim Shaw.
And he's too tall, so I'll have to just bring this microphone up. Dr. Marshall, Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. Where is Australia's Silicon Valley? The United States has had this centre of excellence, research, science. I'm not asking you to rank a university or a city, but doesn't it make superior economic sense that if we had the centres that you were describing then, not just in universities, but in a city like Canberra, on the outskirts of Darwin, where there are centres of research excellence, and to the point about tenure. We are tired of reading of research grant applicants, as many are in the room, spending months and months filling in paperwork when they should be spending those hours and days and months in research. What should the 10-year plan be for tenure for science and researchers within our institutions, and does the CSIRO support the idea of centres of excellence similar to Silicon Valley?
So I'm the wrong person to ask about tenure.
Oh, please give it a crack.
Every time I've been offered a 5-year contract, I always say, how about 2 or 3 and just see how I go, and if I do well, you can give me another one.
Sure.
But look, no, we shouldn't copy Silicon Valley. And place-based innovation has its place. But what's remarkable about Australia, so Future Feed was invented in Townsville, not in a big city, in Townsville. It was tested in another part of northern Queensland and eastern Victoria. So I think the wave of the future is a network. I think it's getting the brightest minds in the country together, and technology enables us to do that in a way that Silicon Valley couldn't have been done back then. Also, we're different. We're completely different. Silicon Valley did some amazing things, but they completely missed agriculture and food as an investment area. One of the companies that we created, which is literally a unicorn, is V2 Foods. Mm-hmm. Created in Australia in less than 2 years from idea to positive revenue, backed by Woolworths and Hungry Jack's. You can buy V2 burgers on the shelf in Woolies, you can get one in a Hungry Jack's burger store. It's competing head-to-head and beating the Impossible Burger in the US that took $800 million of venture capital to fund it. I can tell you, we put a few million into it to get it started and made it a real business. Australia can do that. Australia can create extraordinary things because we know areas like agriculture. Our healthcare system is extraordinary. We don't value it, but we should. But I can tell you, having lived in the US for 26 years, I really am happy to be in Australia. So we have certain strengths that are just phenomenal, that if we back them, if we trust ourselves, if we trust our scientists, we can be world leading in those areas. And that's how we get to that better future that I'm talking about.
In those current conversations you're having with the new Science Minister, have you floated the idea of expansion of the new Colombo plan to include international research scientists from Asia Pacific, but particularly from mainland China? We know that politicians aren't scientists and researchers, and that's a good thing, because maybe that soft diplomacy between mainland China and Australian researchers can continue, as you alluded to earlier.
Yeah, probably the one thing to say about Ed Husic as the new Science Minister, I've been in the innovation sector for more than 30 years. He knows, I think, almost everyone that I know. So I think he's really on the front foot when it comes to understanding the innovation sector and what it needs. So you probably should ask him.
Do you support longer tenure, though, for researchers?
Well, I don't support it for myself, so I can hardly support it for anyone else. I think. Look, again, I spent my life building companies and turning science into solutions. For me, it wasn't about being locked into a contract. It was about doing a good job and delivering. And if you did, then you got to do more of it. And if you didn't, you went and did something else. So I'm the wrong person to ask.
Thank you for your speech.
Sure.
He's a long-time former fellow vice president of the club, now director.
Hello.
Steve Lewis.
Dr. Marshall, thank you. Steve Lewis. I am a director, former working journalist, although Ian Chubb always claimed that was an oxymoron when it came to my good self. America and China are in a tech war. It's a new space race. Billions in AI, quantum biotech, neuro, just their brain projects alone would dwarf your budget tenfold. We have banned Huawei 4 years ago. Malcolm Turnbull banned Huawei, one of their key technologies or technology companies. So to follow on from Jess Malcolm's question, if you like, we've got a geopolitical war between these two superpowers. As the head of Australia's leading premier science agency, what's your view? Does science break down geopolitical boundaries, or do we throw our eggs into the American basket at the expense of working with the Chinese?
So science is the language that transcends those boundaries, and CSIRO has had a deep relationship with the Chinese Academy of Science for more than 5 decades. Australia was the first Western country to really embrace China in that way. I asked Chairman Bao, the gentleman who runs the Chinese Academy of Science.
Chairman Mao? What?
Bao.
Oh, sorry.
Bao.
Of course. I was going to ask you what to say on.
Why do you waste time with us? We're so tiny. CAS is 150,000 people. We're about 5,500.
Sure.
I asked him, why do you waste time with us? And he said, because we're so small. And he said, because when we were small, you invested time with us. And we've always treasured that. When the pandemic started, there was a moment where I had to reach out to him to ask for help. Like, what do you know? What can you tell us? They gave us the information we needed, as our American counterparts did. In that pandemic, that facility I talked about, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, there's only about 5 of those labs in the world. Every day they were talking to each other, China, the US, Europe, because we had to share the data to solve the common challenge. I think science just has this wonderful way of breaking down those barriers. China needs us. We have amazing solutions for climate, for environment, and their common problems. So I think if we use that history and that basis, we can overcome these geopolitical challenges going forward because we have to solve these.
So no qualms about working with the Chinese on scientific. No qualms about working with China on scientific issues.
On things that are global challenges like solving a pandemic, solving climate change, global issues, absolutely work with China, and we have done for 5 decades, more than 5 decades, and absolutely work with the US. We recently signed, I think it's the first time, well, Csiro for at least, but I think anyone signed a major partnership with a US national lab, and we've started to be recognised in the United States that national labs are prestigious in the US. They're starting to recognise what we do here as really necessary for what they do. So I think that partnership will get deeper with both countries because they both need us. They both need what we bring to the table.
Cheers.
We have 4 minutes on the clock to wrap up beautifully in our broadcast window, and we're very lucky that our final question comes from Australian Nobel laureate, Professor Brian Schmidt.
Certainly not a working journalist. Larry,
Csiro
is a pretty unique institution worldwide because it is a comprehensive national lab. It sits alongside Australian industry, Australian universities and research institutes. I guess in the outline today, you've shown we have big challenges and opportunities. Perhaps you could articulate very cleanly the value proposition that Csiro brings to the Australian people now, but I want to look to the next 10 years. What could you be doing more to help us solve these 7 megatrends, the opportunities and the challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So there are 39 great Australian universities and a number of other phenomenal research institutions. And in the past, and Ciro's 100 years old, like many institutions, it tended to think a bit too internally. It tended to think it had to provide the solutions. I think the change that we've enjoyed, and Brian and I have run our institutions for about the same period of time, we've really tried to break that model and do much deeper, much more open collaboration. So Brian has people in my organisation, I have people in his, and we've started to look at it as not my science or your science, but Australia's science. Most of the interventions that I've made as the head of Csiro, like the fund, like on the national incubator, like opening up our labs to be national labs shared with the universities, has been about pulling Australia together because we can't, it's too hard to compete internationally if we try to go it alone. But when we work together, and Brian isn't the only one, but you're probably the first one, it's extraordinary what we've done. And I know I can't mention the amazing plastics company that we quietly invested in a few years ago that's now almost a unicorn. But we both sat down 6 years ago and said, how are we going to solve this problem for Australia? How are we going to create more opportunities for our children when they graduate, not to do what I did, leave the country for almost 30 years because you couldn't get a job in science here. That's changed now. And if we keep on that trajectory, which I think not only will we keep on it, we'll actually amplify it, we'll create many, many more of those opportunities so that my children, Patrick and Jessica, don't need to go back to the United States. They can actually stay here and they'll do better here. People like Michelle Simmons, cracking the quantum code. Amazing research across the sector. Those 250 companies that we created, those thousands of jobs, when we started, that was thought to be impossible. But now we're like, maybe it could be 10,000, maybe it could be 20,000 jobs. That's our opportunity. That's what science brings. And don't forget, Australia, because of those 39 amazing universities, is global top 10 for science. There's not many things we're global top 10 in, so let's back it and leverage it to make a better future. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our broadcast. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Dr. Larry Marshall. We started with surfboards and we managed to cover off on male pattern baldness and peroxide dyeing and everything in between, global geostrategic politics and all the rest. Larry, we never like to let our guests leave empty-handed. This gets you into the coveted car park upstairs. So thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great questions.
Stay up here for, I think they might want to get a quick photo before we run away.
Sure, yeah,
so if you've got a snap up.